welcome to Edison Open House Future Transport 2021. In this session, we're going to showcase the work of Renergen. It's a natural gas and helium company, and with me is its CEO, Stefano Morani. Stefano, welcome right from Johannesburg, I think.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, natural gas. Immediately people will think, well, what are we talking about, natural gas? Surely that's a fuel from the past. What's Renergen's future?
So it's an interesting question. There are two ways to answer that question. Firstly, it's a known fact that the majority of the world's helium reserves come from natural gas, and helium is a particularly critical commodity. So much so, in fact, that in 2018 it was declared the second most critical element to United States national security. The only way that you're going to get helium out the ground is with natural gas, except in a few rare circumstances where there is no associated natural gas, but those deposits are few and far between. The second aspect is that the natural gas in the Renergen deposit is globally unique, and it's globally unique by virtue of the fact that the gas originates from bacteria as opposed to traditional fossil sources. So to explain, our first wells were drilled in the 1950s and blow more gas today than they did in the 1950s. And that's because the gas regenerates, hence the play on Renergen in our name. But we've got live microbes. There are these extremophiles living about 2 kilometers underground. They're eating carbonaceous material, producing methane, and that makes its way up to the surface via faults and fissures. Fortunately, in our case, it also comes up with the world's highest concentration of associated helium too.
Why then are you thinking about this as a future transport fuel?
So it's an intermediate step, let's put it this way. And we're not catering to the smaller vehicles, we're catering to heavy industry. It certainly can't be argued at this stage that the energy density contained in a battery is not sufficient to be able to run trucks on the road, certainly not under South African conditions where a truck will run for 10 to 14 hours a day and they carry combination payloads of 50 tons. So you're not going to achieve that with an EV. It's just not possible. And then even if you try to recharge it, you're not going to be able to recharge it because our grid is too constrained. That then only opens the door for hydrogen. And whilst hydrogen is a great technology in the application of heavy trucking, the issue that you have is that at present you need somewhere in the region of about 40 to 45 ounces of platinum per truck if you're going to run the combination payloads that we run in South Africa. And that cost base is just too high. So we do need some kind of a transition fuel. And this is where if you've got a renewable resource such as ours, it makes perfect sense to deploy it locally in the displacement of diesel, where you can really make a very, very big impact in a very short space of time while the other technologies catch up.
I mean, this is a real issue, isn't it? People forget that it's not an immediate switchover. There is going to be a gradual transition. And I'm guessing another problem is how do you adapt the vehicles that are already on the road? Because the turnover is perhaps, I don't know what it is for trucks, but 20%, let's say, of the stock renews every year. But then that's the other 80% whose life cycle is actually decades. We all know tractors and Land Rovers still going after 50 years.
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. And the point over here is that to not do anything because you're waiting for an alternative technology to come along is worse than doing something in the interim while technology catches up. And what we're seeing is that in the emerging markets, particularly, the kind of legislation that's required in order to make it viable to run these alternative technologies doesn't exist. These emerging markets, such as South Africa, such as many jurisdictions, need these interim steps. And the business model that we put forward is that we are more cost competitive for a cleaner source of fuel without any legislative involvement. In time, when legislation catches up in these markets and legislation makes it such that it is more cost competitive to run completely green technologies, then that will transition. But to do absolutely nothing in the vain hope that the other technologies, which are probably still about a decade to 2 decades away for the heavy trucks to catch up, is just worse than not doing anything at all. And we see this as a major step in the right direction. To put it in context, we've run a little pilot trial simply on 10 buses. It was just to convince one customer. We started that trial in May of 2016. Those 10 buses, since May of 2016, have reduced the total amount of greenhouse gases that their diesel counterparts have put out by 3.5 million kilograms. That's only 10 buses. And yes, it's not 100% green, but the point is that the methane in our field is going to make its way up into the atmosphere anyway. You can't stop it. It's a biological process. So you may as well at least just intercept that methane, burn it, convert it into carbon dioxide, which also reduces the greenhouse gas emission impact of this field because it is a biological field. And along the way, if you're managing to substitute diesel, then you're also removing carcinogens from the atmosphere.
So yours is very much a pragmatic business that draws on something that is unique to South Africa. What is it unique? Are there other deposits around the world of this sort?
There are not many deposits in the world that were formed as a result of an asteroid. It doesn't get much more unique than this. And it wasn't just one asteroid. It was, in fact, 2 asteroids that struck in the same place 2 billion years apart. So the chances of finding anything like this anywhere else on the planet are very remote.
So they were Renergen, powered by a double asteroid hit. It's quite a unique claim, that. So just talk me through the investment side of it. What are some of the milestones that investors should be looking out for as Renergen ramps up production of liquid natural gas and helium?
Well, this is an exciting year for us. So as it stands right now, we're in the final throes of the construction of the pipeline. The plant is almost complete, and most of the components are on a ship and coming to South Africa. So and we've obviously embarked on quite an extensive drilling campaign. We're drilling 6 wells at the moment. So the next milestones that investors can expect are completion of the drilling campaign, completion of the pipeline and the handover of the pipeline, the completion of the liquefaction plant, which we're then anticipating will go into production in Q4 of this year. And then more importantly, we embarked on some feasibility studies surrounding phase 2. Now we've designed the project into 2 stages. The first stage is a phase 1 operation, which is small. It's a proof of concept that was financed by the United States government. The proof of concept was to bring online a small amount of helium, about 150% of South Africans' consumption, and a little bit of LNG, enough to power about 400 to 600 trucks. Phase 2 is a project that we've been working on in terms of sizing the total extent of what the field is capable of. And that's a project that we're hoping to bring online in 2023. We'll be announcing later this year the results of the drilling campaign and the results of the feasibility studies on the technology. And if all goes according to plan, that'll be another major milestone that investors should look out for, because that'll determine the size and the turn-on dates for phase 2, which we're hoping at this stage that we'll be able to turn phase 2 on in 2023.
So you're a company that eventually wants to do itself out of a business. In other words, you are there as a solution in the short term, but actually the short term could be measured in decades. But presumably the helium side of your business will still be important. So
if you look at the world's helium concentrations, they vary. Qatar sits at 0.01% helium. Of the 7 current countries producing helium, the United States are the rock stars. They're at 0.35% aggregate across their fields. We drilled a well at 12%. Our average is 3.4%. If you need, in this day and age with technology the way that it is, you can't do without helium. And I'm not going to harp on the uses of helium. I think Edison covers that particularly well. The long and the short of it is that if you want to try and reduce the lowest greenhouse gas emission helium in any kind of scale, then you need to have the highest concentration possible. And to put it in context, if we had to match Qatar's output in helium, which we believe our field can do with the kind of concentrations that we have, we'd only have to put up a 280 megawatt power station, which is tiny. You compare that to Qatar's 77 million tons of LNG they have to produce per annum. All of a sudden, it becomes quite a logical choice from the planet's perspective that if we want this resource, then we have to remove it in the most carbon-friendly way possible. And this is Renergen's USP.
It's a fascinating business. I wondered whether you had thought about what, let me just try this question again. Sorry, Martin. How do you see the future of transport?
So it's a very difficult question to answer without stepping on people's toes. I tend to take a very pragmatic view on this, and it's a journey. We're not going to get to the end goal by just sitting on the sidelines waiting for people to get there, which is why we took the approach that we did in terms of rolling out LNG as an intermediate step. We also see that LNG as an interim step, instead of offsetting coal on the power side when you've got things like solar, it makes more sense to displace the highest polluting fossil fuel, which is diesel and polyfuel. And so those are the target markets in South Africa that we're deliberately targeting as interim measures until South Africa's grid comes right and until there are better technologies that you can deploy in trucks. In terms of EV, I can see retail, moms and pops driving kids to school in EVs. I absolutely see that as being the right way to go, and I can see that being rolled out very fast. And this is where Elon was an absolute visionary in that regard. I can see that the small delivery trucks in a city, EV is the right way to go. I don't see EV working for the heavy trucks for reasons that I've elaborated on earlier. I do see that until we've got some other form of ultra-high density means of carrying energy in a way that can be used inside either an internal combustion engine or something else that doesn't require as much platinum as hydrogen currently uses, there needs to be another solution, either a more effective way of utilizing the hydrogen or a more energy dense way of storing the battery. And I don't believe that we've solved that as a species. I don't believe that we've solved that yet. The other challenge in my mind, and this is probably the slightly more controversial topic that I'd want to raise, is if you had to look at a life cycle of an energy, and this is where the pragmatism comes in. You need to think about the total, let's call it cradle to grave in terms of the energy that you're generating. And I'll give it by way of example. Let's assume that you take 100 units produced by a solar panel. You put that 100 units of energy from the solar panel, you stick it into the grid, and yes, there may be some losses on the grid, but you'll effectively end up with 90 of those 100 units being converted into some form of kinetic energy, which we can use. And that's great. The problem at the moment is that if you take so-called green hydrogen, you take 100 units, and after you've electrolyzed it, and then you've transported it, and you've put it into some means that you can transport it, and then you've transported it, and then you take it through to the other end, and that energy is then released in one way or another, which has its own losses. You take your 100 units, which could have gone into the grid and offset coal, it goes into this entire elaborate chain, and it ends up on the other side, and you're probably getting somewhere like 22 to 26 units of that energy, which means that as a species, we've just wasted 70 units of solar energy, which required a solar panel. And unfortunately, the manufacture of that solar panel, if it wasn't ethically manufactured, chances are that the manufacturer, in order to keep the costs down, probably released nitrogen trifluoride into the atmosphere, which is 10,000 times worse than carbon dioxide, and more than likely ended up producing a lot more pollution than had you just burnt the fossil fuel in the first place. So this comes back to the whole pragmatic view that we need to, as a species, take a far more pragmatic view, not jump onto the next big thing, but we need to think it through from cradle to grave. What are all of the impacts and the inputs going into this before we just jump onto the next big thing?
So think about the whole ecosystem, and people, for instance, forget that electric vehicles also incur a carbon cost when they're manufactured. They're not.
That's it.
Yeah, they're not sort of carbon free. So where do you see the whole industry going? It's a very, very exciting time. You've chosen the pragmatic route, but looking at the industry more widely, from your very particular vantage point, where do you think the sector is going as a business sector?
So hydrogen is very useful in certain applications. I think the aeronautic industry, I can definitely see an application for hydrogen there. It makes perfect sense. It's cryogenic. There are all sorts of positive attributes that hydrogen will work very well in planes for. As I said, I can see EV having a place, and I think that we need to roll out EV as fast as we can. Heavier transport, either we need to legislate and break up the loads into smaller vehicles that can handle EV, but that's going to take time, or we need to come up with a better technology. I'm not convinced on hydrogen for heavy trucks. I think that the cradle to grave analysis is not there yet. And I also don't think that you're going to be able to convince emerging markets to add that additional cost base into their GDPs at this stage for them to make that paradigm shift from fossil fuels into hydrogen. Where I can see new and innovative technologies coming out are people that are capable of recapturing CO2 from the atmosphere and converting that into traditional fossil fuels, which then burn in the engine, and you've got your perfect carbon recycle. I can see that having a major positive benefit to a much faster transition, for the simple reason that you'd have 100% recycling of the same energy. But in doing so, the world doesn't need to retool and manufacture an entire new type of technology, which in and of itself is also going to produce carbon dioxide. So I think it's horses for courses. I don't think that there's going to be one silver bullet that will solve all of the challenges. I think EV takes out a portion of the market. I think hydrogen definitely has its place, and that would most likely be in the aeronautic sector. And I would see the ability to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere and use that into traditional fossil fuel burning engines for the heavier transport sector as being the ideal solution.
Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. So Stefano Moroni of Renergen, thank you very much. And remember, Reneigen, a company powered not by one, but two asteroids.
Thank you.